40 years ago, October 20th at 6:30, is about the time that we went down.
The story of Lynyrd Skynyrd's tragic plane crash has fascinated music fans for decades because it combines success, warning signs, human error, and heartbreaking loss into one unforgettable chapter of rock history. For years, people spoke about the crash as if it were surrounded by mystery, bad luck, or even fate. Some believed the band had somehow been cursed, while others pointed to strange coincidences that seemed impossible to ignore. Yet when investigators and historians examined the facts, the reality proved far more troubling than any myth. The mystery was not that nobody knew what happened. The mystery was why so many warning signs appeared before the disaster, and why those warnings failed to prevent it. By October 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd had become one of the most successful and influential rock bands in America. Songs such as Free Bird, Simple Man, Sweet Home Alabama, and Gimme 3 Steps had transformed the Jacksonville, Florida musicians into national stars. Their blend of Southern storytelling, blues influences, and hard-driving rock music connected with millions of fans across the United States. Every tour seemed bigger than the last, every album sold more copies, and every concert strengthened their reputation as one of the greatest live acts of the decade. The release of Street Survivors in October 1977 seemed to confirm that the band had reached a new creative peak. Critics praised the record, fans embraced the songs, and many people believed the group was only beginning to discover how successful it could become. Yet behind the scenes, a series of decisions and circumstances were quietly pushing the band toward disaster. Touring during the 1970s was grueling. Major bands spent countless hours traveling from city to city, often performing several times each week while juggling interviews, promotional appearances, and recording commitments. To maintain such demanding schedules, many groups relied heavily on private aircraft. Flying saved time and allowed musicians to reach distant venues quickly. For Lynyrd Skynyrd, air travel had become a necessity rather than a luxury. Unfortunately, the aircraft being used for the tour was not a modern jet, but an aging Convair CV-240 that had already accumulated decades of service. While older airplanes can operate safely when properly maintained, the Convair had reportedly generated concerns among people familiar with its condition. Stories later emerged suggesting that mechanical issues had been noticed before the fatal flight. There were reports of engine problems, discussions about maintenance, and worries expressed by passengers. At the time, however, none of these concerns seemed large enough to force the cancellation of performances or the abandonment of the aircraft. Looking back, those warnings appear far more significant. Hindsight has a cruel way of highlighting dangers that people overlook in the moment. What seemed like isolated problems before the crash would later be viewed as part of a pattern that should never have been ignored. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the tragedy involves the idea that opportunities existed to avoid the disaster entirely. According to various accounts that emerged over the years, concerns about the aircraft had circulated before Lynyrd Skynyrd ever boarded it. Stories spread that other musicians and industry professionals had questioned the plane's reliability. Whether every detail of those stories is completely accurate remains a matter of debate, but the larger point remains difficult to dismiss. The aircraft was not universally trusted. Yet touring schedules are powerful forces. Concerts had been booked, tickets had been sold, and fans were expecting performances. Canceling shows would have created financial losses and disappointed thousands of people. As a result, the tour continued. No one could know that only days after the release of Street Survivors, one of rock music's most devastating tragedies would occur. What makes the story especially heartbreaking is the knowledge that discussions reportedly existed about changing travel arrangements. Some members of the organization were aware of concerns. Alternatives were considered. Yet those changes never happened in time. The difference between life and death sometimes comes down to a single decision, a single day, or a single flight. Among the many stories that emerged after the crash, few are as haunting as those involving Ronnie Van Zant. The lead singer had developed a reputation for making comments about dying young. Friends, relatives, and band associates later recalled conversations in which Van Zandt suggested he did not expect to live a long life. Some remembered him saying he would never reach the age of 30. Others recalled statements about wanting to go out on top rather than fade away. At the time, such remarks may have sounded like the dramatic words of a rock star. After the crash, however, they took on an entirely different meaning. Human beings naturally search for patterns after tragedy. When something terrible happens, we look backward and reinterpret old conversations through the lens of what followed. Whether Van Zandt possessed genuine intuition about his fate or was simply expressing a common rock and roll attitude can never be known. Yet those remarks became part of the mythology surrounding the crash. They contributed to the feeling that something ominous had been hanging over the band long before disaster struck. Similar stories surrounded other members of the traveling group, particularly Cassie Gaines, who reportedly felt uncomfortable flying on the aircraft. Such stories add emotional weight to the tragedy because they create the impression that some people sense danger even if they could not fully understand it. On October 20th, 1977, the band boarded the Convair for what was supposed to be another routine trip. The flight began much like countless others. Passengers relaxed, talked, rested, and prepared for the next performance. Nobody expected that history was about to change. During the flight, however, a serious problem developed inside the cockpit. Fuel levels were becoming dangerously low. The details uncovered during subsequent investigations would shock many observers, because the aircraft did not crash due to a dramatic explosion or sudden structural failure. Instead, investigators determined that fuel exhaustion played a central role in the disaster. In simple terms, the aircraft ran out of fuel. This conclusion transformed public understanding of the tragedy. Mechanical failures can be difficult to predict. Severe weather can create unavoidable dangers. Fuel management, however, falls within the responsibilities of flight operations. That reality made the findings especially painful. The disaster increasingly appeared to be something that should never have happened. As fuel levels dropped, the aircraft's engines eventually began failing. The crew realized the seriousness of the situation and attempted to find a suitable location for an emergency landing. Unfortunately, options were limited. Dense forests covered much of the area below. Every passing moment reduced the likelihood of a successful outcome. Inside the cabin, passengers gradually became aware that something was terribly wrong. Survivors later described an atmosphere unlike what many people might imagine. Instead of widespread panic, there was often silence. Some prayed. Others stared ahead. Some simply accepted that events were beyond their control. When an aircraft loses power and begins descending toward the ground, there is little passengers can do. The realization of helplessness can create a strange calm. As the plane descended, trees rushed upward. The impact, when it came, was catastrophic. The aircraft struck the forest, tearing through branches and vegetation before breaking apart. The violence of the crash inflicted devastating injuries on nearly everyone aboard. Ronnie Van Zandt was killed. Steve Gaines was killed. Cassie Gaines was killed. Several others also lost their lives. Survivors suffered broken bones, severe trauma, and injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. In a matter of seconds, one of the most successful bands in America had been shattered. The aftermath of the crash was a nightmare. Survivors found themselves surrounded by wreckage in a remote area. Many were injured too severely to move easily. Others struggled to understand what had happened. Some searched desperately for friends and bandmates. The crash site became a scene of confusion, pain, and disbelief. Among the most remarkable stories from those moments is the account of survivors who sought help despite serious injuries. Their determination contributed significantly to the rescue effort. Emergency responders eventually arrived, but reaching the site was not easy. The remote location complicated rescue operations and delayed assistance. For those trapped among the wreckage, every minute felt endless. The physical suffering was immense, but the emotional trauma proved equally severe. Survivors later spoke about memories that never left them. The sounds, sights, and emotions of that day remained vivid decades later. Tragedies do not end when rescue teams arrive. In many ways, they are only beginning. As news of the crash spread across America, shock turned into mourning. Lynyrd Skynyrd was not merely another successful band. To many fans, the group represented a way of life. Their music reflected pride, resilience, and authenticity. Songs such as Sweet Home Alabama and Free Bird had become cultural touchstones. The sudden loss of key members felt personal to countless listeners. Radio stations interrupted programming. News broadcasts reported developments. Fans gathered to share grief and memories. The timing of the disaster made everything even more surreal. Street Survivors had been released only days earlier. The album's original cover art depicted the band standing amid flames, an image that many people found disturbing after the crash. The cover was quickly replaced, but the coincidence contributed to the sense that the tragedy was surrounded by eerie symbolism. For some observers, it seemed impossible to separate the album from the events that followed. What should have been a celebration of artistic achievement became linked forever with loss and mourning. The years that followed were difficult for everyone connected to the band. Survivors faced long recoveries. Many underwent multiple surgeries. Physical injuries lingered for decades. Some members struggled with emotional trauma and survivor's guilt. These psychological wounds are often less visible than broken bones, but they can be just as devastating. People who survive tragedies frequently ask themselves painful questions. Why did they live when others died? Could anything have been done differently? Such questions rarely have satisfying answers, yet they remain. Survivors carried those burdens long after headlines faded. Their lives continued, but they were permanently altered. Every performance, every interview, and every anniversary served as a reminder of what had happened. The crash became a defining event that shaped not only public perceptions of the band, but also the personal experiences of those who lived through it. Despite the tragedy, Lynyrd Skynyrd's music endured. In many ways, the crash transformed the band from successful musicians into cultural legends. New generations discovered their songs. Free Bird became one of the most recognizable rock anthems ever recorded. Simple Man found new audiences through films, television, and streaming services. Sweet Home Alabama remained a fixture of American popular culture. The enduring popularity of these songs ensured that the band's legacy would survive long after the original lineup was gone. Yet that legacy has sometimes been accompanied by controversy. Disputes emerged regarding how the band's story should be told. Lawsuits, documentaries, books, and films sparked debates among survivors, family members, and fans. Questions arose about ownership of memories, historical accuracy, and the commercialization of tragedy. Such disputes are not uncommon when famous figures become part of cultural history. The challenge lies in balancing respect for the victims with public interest in understanding what happened. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Lynyrd Skynyrd tragedy is that disasters often result from a chain of events rather than a single cause. Catastrophes rarely appear out of nowhere. Instead, they develop through a series of decisions, oversights, circumstances, and missed opportunities. The plane crash of October 1977 illustrates this reality with heartbreaking clarity. Concerns reportedly existed about the aircraft. Alternatives may have been available. Warning signs appeared, yet the tour continued. No single factor alone guaranteed disaster, but together they created conditions that eventually proved fatal. This is why many people describe the crash as preventable. The word does not erase uncertainty, nor does it imply that every outcome could have been predicted with certainty. Rather, it reflects the painful recognition that opportunities existed to change the course of events. When investigators reached their conclusions, the mystery was largely solved. What remained was not confusion but sorrow. Today, decades after the crash, fans continue visiting memorials, listening to albums, and sharing stories about the band. The site of the crash has become a place of remembrance. People leave flowers, notes, and tributes. They come not only to honor those who died, but also to reflect on the fragility of life. Success, fame, and talent offer no protection from tragedy. One moment a band can stand at the peak of its career, looking forward to years of achievement. The next moment, everything can change. That reality explains why the Lynyrd Skynyrd story continues to resonate. It is not merely a tale about musicians. It is a story about ambition, warning signs, human decisions, loss, survival, and legacy. The mystery that once surrounded the crash has largely been resolved, but the emotional impact remains. The truth turned out to be far less mysterious than many expected. It was not fate, a curse, or some unexplained phenomenon. It was a tragedy shaped by human choices and circumstances. And perhaps that is what makes the answer so unsettling. The disaster was not inevitable. It was not written in the stars. It was a catastrophe that might have been avoided, and that knowledge continues to haunt fans nearly 50 years later. Even now, when the opening notes of Free Bird begin to play, listeners are reminded not only of extraordinary music, but also of a story that remains one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the history of rock and roll.